So no word yet on a G20 meeting between Presidents Trump and Xi. If the US does impose extra tariffs, I guess the question is who's really going to suffer the pain?
Well, President Trump somehow thinks that the foreigners, like the Chinese or the Mexicans, pay the tariffs. Tariffs are nothing more than a sales tax. This year alone, the estimates are that it's raised the cost of Americans by about $423. It's probably double next year. And this is also erasing much of the benefits that the Republicans tried to pass on a tax bill. So they tried to cut taxes, and yet they're going to be raising the cost for Americans across the board with these tariffs.
Well, there's going to have to be some sort of circuit breaker at some point. How do you see all this playing out?
Well, I mean, that's the problem with trade wars and this tit for tat, and that is it is hard to find a circuit breaker that saves face. We have two very proud people who are in a political situation in both their countries, not just Donald Trump, but also Xi Jinping. And so it's a very high stakes game. And normally you don't really want to have such high stakes with the two largest economies in the world. There are other ways of going about this, but not the way we are right now.
Fred, what's the likelihood, in your view, that President Trump could play up these tensions with China as a strategy going into the 2020 elections?
Oh, without question. I mean, I think what we just saw at the Mexican situation on the border was all about 2020. It was all about trying to show he is tough on immigration. And I think the president's trying to say, I'm the only one who's actually been tough with China all these years. I'm the only one who stood up for you. And so I think this is all about politics.
Given that even if we were to see more tariffs, the inflationary effect and the hit on consumers could have a lag effect. Does that mean that this strategy could work?
Well, I'm loath to, in the middle of something, to say the strategy is wrong. I mean, President Trump has chosen this strategy. I wouldn't pursue it this way. When I talk to people, I just came back from Berlin at a trade conference. I think there's some consternation about why we're going this alone. We have a lot of the rest of the world is with us, but we're not really bringing them along to make this a much more compelling fight and a compelling negotiation with China, which we could do, because most of the rest of the world agrees with our point of view.
Fred, there is also the issue of Hong Kong to consider. We have a chart here on the Bloomberg that shows the Hong Kong dollar short-term volatility really surging on the back of all this controversy surrounding the extradition bill. And the US, bipartisan, in a rare display, throwing its weight behind the protesters. To what extent does this cloud the waters for US-China trade talks?
I think it does enormously. You know, there was recently a meeting of the number of export credit agencies in China a week or two ago. And the Canadians chose not to send a representative because of fear of what would happen if they had a government official in Beijing. That is a really, really bad sign. You just mentioned on the show recently about Alibaba listing in Hong Kong. I think all of this gets related to each other and is a real jeopardy to Hong Kong as an independent governance. You know, it's two systems, one country, and I think that's in jeopardy. I will tell you another thing, takeaway when I was in Berlin just yesterday. One of the beneficiaries may be Singapore, because that is seen as a much more reliable and stable than what we're seeing right now in Hong Kong.
Yeah, that was a point that was being made recently by Kyle Bass as well, the head of the Hayman Capital Hedge Fund, that Singapore perhaps looked a bit more appealing. But I just want to turn briefly, if we can, to the other trade dispute, which has gone quiet now with Mexico. These threats over immigration and tariffs on Mexico, do you consider them to be credible, considering the huge knock-on effects that would have for the supply chain in the US?
Well, that's the huge problem. You know, when Donald Trump talked about slapping a tax on cars coming in from Mexico, the cars that come from Mexico are things like GMC trucks, Lincoln Mercurys, Fords, also Hondas and Nissans that are assembled in Mexico. So this would really cripple the whole global supply chain. Has been built over the last 20 years, and it has also been built on stability and reliability with NAFTA, and all of that is in jeopardy now.
Fred, we are seeing geopolitical tensions rising with Iran. We have seen, of course, the sanctions on Iranian oil since May. Now, President Trump threatening to even sanction Instex, which would be the vehicle where Europe and Iran can actually trade. So is the Iran nuclear deal going to survive in this environment?
Well, we've already pulled out, and it's not clear that we can put all the pieces back together again. It's not clear that Iran is open to doing that. So I think that, we are sort of creating fires all over the world between China, Mexico, Iran, and we need to be lowering the volume a little bit and having some thoughtful talks and finding common ground. But that is not the style of foreign diplomacy and how we're conducting our affairs right now. And I think part of the problem is the U.S. economy could suffer, and consumers are clearly going to suffer.